سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين آمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Very good to see you all today again after the break. Inshallah, I hope you enjoyed. We finally come to the final part of our three-course series. Inshallah, the Eschatology, or Ilm Alamatu Sa'a, Ilm Akhir Zaman, the knowledge of the signs of the last day. A very important part of the Islamic teaching that it's important. I felt it's important for us to appreciate the historical context and the current world global context to understand the information or the knowledge that is within our tradition. Why study Akhir al-Zaman? Why study the signs of the last day? You will come across many people saying, "Oh, don't get involved in those things, Dajjal and these Yajuj and Majuj and these things. Just focus on your ibadah." Or there's people who will say, "Don't bother with that stuff," etc. Mainly because amongst, I'd say, most people, they can't make sense of that knowledge that is there. Yeah, it's very confusing, and that's why often people say, "Look, don't bother going down there." I'm talking about here people of knowledge as well, because there's a lot of information and a lot of stuff, especially in the books of hadith, which can lead people to a lot of confusion. And I had the blessing of studying with certain scholars. First of all, Sheikh Hamza Yusus, may Allah protect him, who had a lot of insights into this field, and he's one of the leading thinkers. And he actually made that one of his things he really specialized in as well. So he focused on these things. And much later on, I had the blessing of coming across the teachings of Sh Imran Hoserin, may Allah protect him, who also has focused on this branch of knowledge and put a lot of his time and thinking into it. So this course is really drawing from both of those leading scholars and adding a couple of few insights or result of my own research to that as well. But I'd say 80%, 90% is from those teachers. Now, I want to say a couple of words about these scholars, because sometimes they can be controversial people as well, and a lot of criticism is directed towards them, particularly Sheikh Imran. And what we have to understand, I want you all to reflect upon, is that this is the case with any original thinker within our tradition. And we don't have many original thinkers within our current scholarly tradition. And there's many reasons for that. Part of them are just the gradual decline in the level of scholarship over many years and even centuries now. You're probably aware at one point in time, the sort of, people said, "Oh, the doors of Ijtihad were closed, a few centuries ago." Then other scholars came and said, "No, actually the doors of Ijtihad were never closed, and that's just a modernist critique," which is, But the fact is, the doors of Ijtihad could never be closed, because technically you always can be a mujtahid, but the doors were jammed shut to be very difficult to open because the bar was set so high. And anyway, we don't want to go into that a lot, but the thing to say is this, that the majority of our madrasas, in the Muslim world have decayed over time. The level of scholarship has decayed over time. So we don't have great intellect for various reasons. And where you do have scholars that are of intellectual caliber and they are coming up with original thought, which is what is required in the modern age because of the challenges we face, the challenges that the Muslims face intellectually, culturally, through all of scientific advancements, technology, etc., requires people of brilliant thinking and intellect. When those people will come with the whole point is of originality. You have to be able to think outside the box, right? Immediately, that type of thing will come across a lot of critique and criticism. Now that's partly the nature of it. When any scholar comes up with anything new, other scholars will critique. And that can be a healthy thing. That is a good thing. But it can sometimes turn into a over harsh, and even lead to accusations of deviancy, sometimes even apostasy. This is nothing new. Think about our earliest and greatest scholars, the Imam Abu Hanifas, the Imam Shafi'is, the Imam Ghazalis. These are people who forged original new things. They were thinking outside the box. Imam Abu Hanifa is credited with actually being the founder of jurisprudence in a way, fiqh. And he came across a huge amount of criticism. To the point where there's many, otherwise they're known as our great scholars of our tradition, but when they talk about Abu Hanifa, they're very, very harsh and critical and call him all sorts of things. Yeah, even insulting at times. Yeah, so Imam Shafi'i, another original thinker. Yeah? He came with the usul. He's the first one to codify, and he originated a new science, usul al-fiqh. Yeah, something totally different that hadn't been done before. And he was criticized. Imam al-Bukhari, one of the greatest imams of this ummah, was driven out of his town by other scholars inciting the masses against him. He died on the road, He died on a road in exile from his own hometown. Why? Because he had come up with a radically new thing, a new idea, that we need to have a collection of hadith which are sahih, that are of the highest level of authenticity, so that we can make these available for the normal Muslims and the scholars that are not experts in hadith. But this was considered by other scholars, his own peers, his own other hadith experts, severely criticized him. He was accused at times of deviancy in Aqidah as well. Imam al-Ghazali, the amazing work Ihya Ulumuddin, Imam al-Ghazali is considered by many to be the great mujaddid of this ummah. That was the one who codified Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. During his own lifetime, the Ihya Ulumuddin was burnt in the streets in the Maghrib. That's how they considered it, how deviant it was. They didn't allow people to read. They said, you can't read this book. you know, it's virtually apostasy. They were burning the book. So this is what I want to say about especially Sheikh Imran. You know, I've read his stuff, I've sat with him, I've taken the time to analyze his arguments, you know, and what I will say to you is he's a proper scholar, and he is coming up with original thinking, you know, something that has been lost in the madrasas. He's coming from a strand of Islamic knowledge within the subcontinent that has almost been lost. Because the Dar al-Ulooms of Deoband and the Brailwi madrasas, they've become the dominant threads that have come from India. But there were many other sort of scholarly threads within that tradition that we have almost lost. Anyhow, so what I would say, the reason why I'm talking about this is because obviously a lot of this course will be building upon, you know, work from him and from Sheikh Hamza, as I mentioned. But particularly with Sheikh Imran, you probably know we invited him to Hounslow, to Hamim for a couple of lectures. And there was a storm of protest. Storm of protest from our own community and from others around the country. Scholars that I know, that we know, writing very strong messages, you know, to us, saying, you know, why are you hosting this guy? He's this, that, the other, right? So because this was coming from respected colleagues and scholars, we did take it seriously, and we asked them, you know, what are your exact criticisms? What are your precise objections to this man? You know, and we looked at what they said in response, and there were, I mean, you know, Sidi Umair and Faisal, they were there. We had a meeting, you know, I had a meeting with some of our own people, some of our leading students, and we discussed and looked into those issues, and there was nothing, you know, there was nothing of substance. There's a lot of rumors, a lot of gossip, there's a lot of character assassination, which is wrong. And there are some fatwas he has given, or some ideas which do seem very strange to us, especially Western Muslims. And you know, I don't agree with everything that Sheikh Imran says as well, and I don't agree with all of his positions. But the fact that I don't agree doesn't mean that he doesn't have an argument that he can make based on evidence that he brings, you know. And if he's made some mistakes, that's absolutely fine with me, because all of our greatest scholars made mistakes. Imam Shafi rahimahullah said, I revised my book 40 times and kept making changes each time, kept finding mistakes and improving it each time. And after 40 times I said, you know, that's it, now it's up to Allah, only the book of Allah is perfect. And he published it. You know, every book, every scholar will make mistakes, because only the book of Allah is perfect, and only the Prophet ﷺ is perfect in every opinion or you know. So that's just and especially those who are thinking outside of the box, they're bringing new new insights. They're trying to reflect upon the Quran and the Hadith and try to understand our situation today. Of course, they're going to be coming up with things, and they're going to make mistakes as well. So this is the thing, you know, I just want, hopefully, brothers and sisters to understand. And anyway, you know, we're not here to assess people's character, you know. We're here to benefit from their knowledge and look at their arguments. I'm not here to, that's not our job. So we look at what he's teaching and we look at his arguments and we assess that. Yeah? And whatever we agree with, we can accept. And if we don't agree with some stuff, we say, respectfully, Sheikh, we don't agree with you on this. And I've said that to him to his face. And he's absolutely fine with that, because if you notice, every time he does a talk, he always says, look, this is my opinion. Don't believe this unless you're convinced. You know, so when he's sitting in my house, alhamdulillah, came to my house once, I said to him, Sheikh, respectfully, I disagree with you about X, Y, Z, something about Ottomans or something like that. And it may be that after a few years, I might go back to him and say, actually, Sheikh, I think you were right about that thing. Because I also am in a process of learning and growth. That's happened to me many times. So it's about, we have to keep our minds open, especially in these challenging times we live in. We can't afford to just be blind followers of texts that were written hundreds of years ago. We have to be people that respect those texts and learn from those texts. But then we have to move on. We have to move on. Sheikh Dr. Omar Abdullah said in one of his papers, the title of the paper was, Stop Where They Stopped, Then Proceed. Stop where they stopped, then proceed though. We have to proceed. We learn our tradition, we study those great Imams, the works of the great Imams, and get those great insights, but they didn't have the challenges that we face today. They didn't see what we're seeing today. So they didn't have it, you're not going to find that response there. You're going to find the tools. We're going to find the tools, but we need people capable of getting those tools and using those tools. And I don't like saying this, but just because, of what's happening and these sort of criticisms of certain people, the fact and truth of it is, 90% of people coming out of our madrasas don't know how to use the tools. They've been exposed to the tools. They may have tried to grasp the tools, but they haven't been able to grasp them fully and to be able to use them because they're not easy. Yeah. So that's all I want to say about that. Don't dismiss people. Don't listen to character assassinations. Yeah. Just look at people's arguments. Sheikh Hamza said to us once when we were studying with him, take what's good from someone and leave what's not. That's all we have to do. We're not here to analyze their personal lives or their character. We should have enough knowledge to assess their arguments for the sake of what they're saying. Anyway, so one of the points I want to make here is, as people have said, don't bother studying, don't bother talking about Dajjal and these things. I agree, it shouldn't be the only thing we talk about, which is why this course is just one part of a wider thing, but it is also important. So the point I make here, if it wasn't important, why would the Prophet ﷺ have given us all these signs? Why would the books of hadith have whole chapters full of these signs about the sign of the Day of Judgment? Why would the Quran contain direct reference to signs that will come about if it was not important for us to know? Why would the Prophet ﷺ have devoted time to that? Yeah. And ultimately, for us to respond to our current situation as Muslims, as an ummah, we can't respond to our situation if we don't understand the situation we're in now. And this is what these signs help us to do. So in one hadith related by Muslim and Abu Dawood, the Prophet ﷺ stood up one day to speak to us and told us everything that was going to happen until the hour and left nothing unsaid. So the Day of Judgment, as you probably know, comes by different names within the Quran. Sometimes it's called the hour, as-sa'a. As-sa'a literally means the hour. It's also called Yawm al-Qiyamah, Yawm al-Din, the day of debts, the day when all debts are repaid, and many other names. So this is literally the last day, meaning it's the end of time, literally the end of time. Time comes to an end. Because time is made up of days, isn't it? And we're going through the days, and then that will be the last day. Yeah? So time, akhir az-zaman, the end of time. You know? So time is like a string. You know, there's awwal az-zaman, when Allah created the universe. That's the beginnings of time. And then there's akhir az-zaman, when time is actually going to wrap up. Time itself is going to come to an end. So that's quite phenomenal how when you start coming towards the end of time itself, things start happening. Time starts speeding up is one of the things that are mentioned in the hadith many times. And that sort of makes sense if you think about it as a length of, because when you start coming to the end of something, it starts quickening. So time actually starts speeding up. So the Prophet ﷺ told them everything that will happen from that day until the final day, the end of time. Some of the listeners learnt it by heart and some forgot it. Those friends of mine learnt it. I do not remember it completely. But sometimes it springs to mind, just as one might remember and recognize faithful man with her. So what Hudhayfa is saying is that, we were given this lot of knowledge. I can't remember everything, but there's some things I remember. Others remember more than me. He may have just been being polite as well, partly. Another similar narration where Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal has reported a similar, it may have been the same incident, we don't know. It may have been a different incident. In this case, the Prophet ﷺ stood up after Asr prayer. He stood up and continued to talk until Maghrib. So a long period of time. He mentioned everything that was going to happen until the day of resurrection and left nothing unsaid. Some of us remembered, some of us forgot it. One of the things that he said was, "O people, the world is full of attractive temptations. Allah has appointed you as vicegerents, Khalifa in this world, and He will see how you will act. So guard yourselves against the temptation of the world and of women." Towards the end of his speech, he said, "The sun is about to set, and what remains of this world compared to what has passed is what remains of this day compared to what has passed." So in other words, the Day of Judgment is very close, and that was 1400 years ago. Now, we're going to talk a bit about methodology for when we're looking at this subject of Akhir az-Zaman, which is very important. And as I say, the vast majority, and I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to be arrogant, saying, "Oh yeah, I understand things." A lot of people don't. This is just a fact that these scholars that for whatever reason Allah decreed for me to study with, were able to clarify these things. Yeah? But the vast majority of people, Muslims, are just very confused about these things. Yeah. And part of that is because there's no methodology. It's through a lack of knowledge. So people can't differentiate between different reports that are mentioned in hadith, for example, strong hadith, weak hadith, different sources. So we have to have a very clear understanding of our methodology, and this is what's known also as epistemology. What is your source of knowledge? Epistemology is a study of your sources of knowledge. Now, our ultimate source of knowledge is the Quran. Yeah, there's absolute, that is the absolute 100% infallible source of knowledge. There's nothing else in any way comparable to the Quran. We don't consider our intellect to be above the Quran. You know, if our intellect or reason is telling us something and the Quran is telling us something, we will take the Quran. The Quran is the ultimate. Yeah. So Western rationalist philosophers, they put reason or aql as the ultimate source of knowledge. They've abandoned that now, but they used to. For us, we have the Quran. And then after the Quran, we go to the hadith which are mutawatir. Hadith which are mutawatir. So these are hadiths that have been narrated by so many Sahaba and by so many people from each generation after the Sahaba that we cannot even have a tiny amount of doubt. In other words, we have absolute certainty, as strong as the certainty that we have in the Quran, with one slight difference. Yeah? With one slight difference, which we'll come to later, which is that the wording of hadith are not infallible. The wording of hadith are not 100%. Because the wording of hadith are mainly done by meaning by the Sahaba, not memorized from the Prophet ﷺ. The Sahaba, most hadith are coming through meaning. They heard or they witnessed something from the Prophet ﷺ, and then they related it, but not necessarily in the exact words of the Prophet ﷺ. This is something a lot of people don't realize. It's a fact that all students of knowledge know when they study hadith sciences. There's only few hadiths, I don't know the percentage, maybe 5% or 10% or less, which are where the Sahabi have actually memorized the words of the Prophet ﷺ. And the scholars have got a whole methodology how to identify the hadiths which are memorized and the hadiths which are by meaning. Yeah, there are certain. The only way sometimes you can be sure is sometimes the Sahabi will actually say, "I memorized this from the Prophet ﷺ." You know, like the dua al-istikhara is a good example. Dua al-istikhara, some of the Sahabi that narrated actually said the Prophet ﷺ taught us this, like he made us learn it, memorize it from him. Yeah, and so on. So the thing with mutawatir, we can be 100% sure of their authenticity, but the difference with the Quran is we can also be sure of the actual wording. The wording is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now with the hadith mutawatir, there are two types. Mutawatir by transmission are not that many. This means that they have been narrated by so many Sahaba and then so many people in each generation, the same hadith, that, there's no doubt in it. The same hadith by over 10 Sahaba, let's say. Yeah? Mutawatir by meaning is there's more of that. And in some ways it's more useful to us in this context as well. So it's important to understand what we mean by mutawatir by meaning. Mutawatir by meaning is, a good example is the thing about China. Yeah? How many of us have been to China? Yeah, no, maybe one or two of us. Or no. Do you have 100% certainty that China exists? Yes. Yeah? You do, right? I mean, as much as you have certainty of anything, you believe that China exists, yeah? So, you haven't heard a mutawatir report about China, like, you haven't heard, 20 people narrating the same incident that happened to them in China, have you? But what you have heard is thousands of people talking about China in different contexts, about different things about China. Right? So one person might have said, I went to China. Another person, you might have heard from a different person about China, something else about China. China is a communist country. So these are all different hadiths about China. Yeah? These are all, you've heard thousands of different hadiths about China, but the thing they have in common is China. So even though one of those reports is not mutawatir, so if Khayyam came to me and said to me, yeah, I did go to China, I can tell you definitely I've been to China. And I said, well, okay, yeah, but you're one person. Right? He's one person. I believe him. I believe he's trustworthy, he's not mad. He's got a good memory. I don't think he's hallucinating or anything. So I believe him. I have 99.9% certainty that he is telling the truth. So that hadith is sahih. The hadith is sahih, but it's not mutawatir. Ultimately, that's what the scholars said, Even though that guy is completely reliable, you never know, he might have taken a magic mushroom or something by mistake, or maybe something's come over him, he just wants to mislead you. We don't know, we can't be. So that's, the only way that could become mutawatir is if 20 of you went with Khayyam to China and you all came back and said, yes, we all just went to China. Then I'd say, man, that's mutawatir, yeah. So, but that would be mutawatir by transmission, you're all talking about the same thing. Mutawatir by meaning, you hear about the same. So, for example, let's say Dajjal. I'm just saying by way of example. There may not be any one single hadith which is mutawatir by transmission. There is sahih, definitely. But Dajjal is mentioned in so many different contexts and by so many Sahaba. Going into thousands, let's say, in every generation, that it becomes mutawatir by meaning, because it's common to all of these different reports. They're all talking about Dajjal. Therefore, we can be 100% sure that the Dajjal is true and it's come from the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah, so that's what we call mutawatir by meaning. And then we go to Sahih. So this is where you have, a reliable narration, yes? So then we go to the Sahih. Now these are hadiths which are reliable. Yeah, they've come from reliable people. Absolutely trustworthy people. And we have various collections, as we said, of Sahih. And then you have Sahih hadiths scattered in other collections as well, that may not necessarily be in Bukhari or Muslim. The importance of Bukhari and Muslim, first let's go to Bukhari. The importance of Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah is that by consensus of all the later scholars and his peers, his is still the book that is he put the most rigorous conditions to Sahih. Yeah? So he would not put a hadith in his book unless it reached the most rigorous standard of analysis. The difference with Bukhari, he had many other hadiths as well, but to put into his Sahih, he only put the ones that met the highest level of rigorousness. I haven't got time to go into the methodology now because obviously that will be deviating too much. But Muslim is considered to be the second most careful. And then other books like Abu Dawood and others have a mixture. Bukhari and Muslim generally are considered to have only Sahih in them. A few hadith in each book are debated about whether they reach the level of Sahih or not. But the general scholars would accept that both books are, all of the hadith in both books are Sahih. Now, even within those books, you must remember that Imam al-Bukhari, for example, within his own book, he would have a different threshold depending on what topic he's talking about. So when you're looking at chapters that are to do with law, fiqh, he will have a higher threshold. And when you're talking about and this was a general rule amongst ulama from early on, other topics, let's say for example like seerah, they would be less strict on the authentication. Still, he was very, very high bar anyway. I'm not saying, it's definitely not getting into a lower category. Still the strongest category of sahih, but he'd be slightly less strict in those areas because, for obvious reasons. When you're talking about law, you're talking about halal and haram. And that's a very, very serious matter. To tell someone something is halal or haram, that's a very serious matter. Allah warns against it severely in the Quran. Who are you to make something haram what He hasn't made haram? Or who are you to make something halal that He hasn't made halal? So the scholars, they don't mess with that. But when you're talking about seerah or stories of prophets or things like that, you can slightly relax the criteria because it's not going to impact on people's halal and haram thing, yeah. And then we get on to the weaker hadith, right? So this is then a huge number of hadith. In Bukhari we have about 8,000 to 9,000 hadith, but there's a lot of repetitions, the same hadith through different chains. And he's done that purposely, because every time he brings the same hadith by a different chain, he's showing you that how strong that hadith is. That I don't have it only by one chain, I've got it by many different chains of narrators, many different of my teachers. Anyway, so if you knock out all the repetitions, you're only talking less than 2,000, around 2,000 hadith that he considered to be of that level of sihah. But then when you go into the weaker hadith, then you're talking about tens of thousands. So Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, for example, has about 40,000 hadith. Altogether, there's probably about 100,000, 200,000 hadith out there in one place or another. I'm talking about just even, just a very, even with no chain of narration, things like that. So within the weak hadith, there's many, many different subgradings. Some can be much weaker, some can be stronger than others, and so on. And this is, a lot of the hadith about the signs of the last day are from the category of weak hadith. So we have to think long and hard, what do we do with the weak hadith, What do we do? How are we going to take these? And then you may have other reports that are not hadith. The Sahaba and early scholars may have mentioned things. Yeah. And finally, we have information that has come from the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians. These sources were accepted by Muslim scholars. Some rejected them completely, but most of them accepted them to the point where they're like very weak hadith, or they're like they're basically they're reports. We don't know how authentic they are. They may or may not be, because they don't really have isnad. They haven't preserved the transmission. But on the other hand, they are people of the book, which we know are true revelations. I would like to add a point here, which is something I've reflected on myself in the past, And we'll come back to that in later class as well. Because when you look at the Bible, just look at the Bible, the Old Testament, for example. The Old Testament is also known as the Torah. So it's the book of the Jews, but the Christians have taken that and then they've added a New Testament, which is about Jesus and everything. So the Old Testament, or the Torah, if you look at the stories of the prophets in there, and if you compare that to the stories of the same prophets in the Quran, it's a study that people can do. I haven't done it formally, but I've just from my own knowledge of reading those stories and reading from the Quran, you can see actually they're very similar. I would say almost 80 to 90%. There's an 80 to 90% correspondence there. Now that's quite important and interesting, because it means that has been successfully preserved. That's quite phenomenal, because in the Torah, the Old Testament, you're going back thousands of years. I mean, you're going back about probably 2,000 years before the Prophet ﷺ. Or maybe 1,000 at least, yeah? 1,000, 1,500, I don't know. Prophet Isa is 600 years before the Prophet ﷺ. So this is quite an achievement that the Jews, they kept this book, and it's been preserved to that degree of accuracy. Now we know they've made lots of changes and everything, because that was the thing they did, and they hid certain parts from the people that they knew about and so on. But the fact that is, the Quran is testifying that they have preserved a lot of the true teachings. The true stories are there, So for that reason, I think it is of interest. The Torah, the Old Testament, is of interest to us in this field of eschatology. But also always to be remembered that there's fundamentally going to be unreliability in some way, like the weaker hadith as well. When we look at the weak hadith, we have to always keep in mind there's unreliability there. Right? Just the last point about the Sahih. Remember, we said the Sahaba are narrating things by meaning, right? So they've heard it from the Prophet ﷺ and they're narrating by meaning. So the issue then, especially with this study of Akhir al-Zaman, the signs of the end of time, the Prophet ﷺ, when he was telling about these things that will happen, he was talking about things that was completely outside their frame of reference. Right? Think about it, the sort of technology, the world we live in today, is completely, for people living more than 200 years ago, completely out of, way out there, way out there. I remember even, when we were children, we were watching things like Star Trek, and they're having mobile communicators, and we're thinking, wow, imagine in the future we could have like mobile communicators, you just flip it open and you could talk to someone miles away. It seemed like so futuristic. Now we just do it without thinking twice, just flip it open. And so this is way out there, the way these things are just, people in the past used to have magic, This has gone way beyond the magic. So things like aeroplanes, these things that, so when the Prophet ﷺ is speaking to Sahaba, how is he going to explain these things to them? You know what I mean? So when the Sahaba have heard this as well, how are they going to relay it? We have to analyze the text really carefully. And this is where I was talking about earlier about the sort of blind sort of taqleed culture of the madrasas now. We have to analyze these texts with more of a open mind. We can't get bogged down by the exact wording sometimes as well. Because first of all, Sahaba are narrating by meaning. They're not using the exact wording of the Prophet ﷺ. If they were, there wouldn't be a problem. So when the Prophet ﷺ is describing something to them that is outside of their frame of reference, and then they're relating it, they're gonna, how are they gonna relate that? So there's a natural psychological tendency that human beings have, is to, when you receive something that is outside of your frame of reference, you will then try to digest that somehow to put it with